All right, hi guys, welcome to week 6 of Hack School. Today, as seen on the slides, today we're going to talk about deployment using Vercel and Render, and we're also going to talk a little bit more about React because React is a lot, and we want to cover it again to make sure that you understand it all. But before we get started, we'll kind of go through the starter code. So last week we had a couple of issues with some people like copying and pasting and some people trying to do like merging, and that caused merge conflicts. So we kind of came up with a better process that hopefully should be a lot more straightforward. If you can open up the starter code, I sent it in the Discord. Can I open up Discord on here? So as you can see right here, we have part 6. So go ahead and click on it. And you'll see code within client. So what you're going to do is you're going to, open up your source directory. You're going to go into, for example, components, activity card, and you'll see maybe like just a file called index. Copy and paste everything here. So Command C if you're on a Mac, and go to your VS Code. And here we're going into activity card and components. So just going to open it up like this, and you're going to copy and paste whatever you need into here. And you're going to do that for all of the files. Does that make sense? So like just copy and paste essentially for all the files there. So that's for activity card and that's for index. So now we'll try for another one. So if you go into components, you go into navbar, there's another file called index. Oh, no navbar, I guess. You go into trip card, go into index, copy and paste. And you're going to keep on doing that for pages as well. And specifically for pages, you want to do it for add activity, add trip, and or like just index. And if you have any questions or if you're like having trouble like just staying along, feel free to raise your hand. People will come around and help you out. So to just emphasize again, we're copying over add activity, add trip, index, and pages. And in your components folder, you're copying over index in activity card and trip card. Don't touch navbar. And now also copy over everything in styles as well. Can I have a quick show of hands for everyone who's finished copy and pasting? Just anyone who's done. Cool. We'll give you guys just maybe 3 more minutes. Cool. I think most of you guys have finished copy and pasting. If you have any more questions, just feel free to just raise your hand. Go back to the slides. Oh yeah, and I guess a little warm up for today is just ask your group, what's your favorite food to eat on Thanksgiving? Mine's pumpkin pie. Forgot about that.
I feel like the one in the middle is like right in the center.
It's a kill conversation.
We take up more time. I could just speed through.
Really? I will, my part is like really fast. It's just like code. That's the only thing I just have to do. That's a lot of code.
That sounds so sad.
All right, guys, I hope none of y'all said this like pink turkey on the bottom right-hand corner. I found that in like the depths of the internet. But yeah, here are these important links. And today we'll first talk about async/await. Oh, and also, just a really quick setup thing, seeding to client in your terminal and do npm install Axios. So, if you want me to like write it down, here npm install Axios, and make sure that you're CD'd in client. So. Cool. So let's talk about async and await. If you remember, maybe just like 2 weeks ago, I think we brought it up. Does anyone remember what async means? Just raise your hand if you remember. No one, really? Can you guys guess? Cool, okay, and then I see a raise, yeah? Yeah, that's really close. And then there's await. Does anyone remember what await means? It's literally in the name, I promise. Yeah. That's perfect. So async makes a promise that, or it returns a promise. It makes a function that will return a promise. And then await makes async wait for a promise. So to like explain this in very simple terms, I have to do my laundry today. I know it's really late, but in order for me to do my laundry, I have to first wash my clothes and then dry it. We can apply that same concept to a function where sometimes you need to return specific information before you continue on. So async and await solves this problem by, for example, if we look at this example right here, you could see that this function awaits game stats find before it finishes returning this function. And you can imagine if you had async and you didn't have await, you would have a problem because nothing would be returning and perhaps I think you would get an error. So it pauses the function execution until the promise settles. Whether it's an error or something actually happens, we could see. And this is just a little bit of background of what we'll be covering today, and we'll be using async and await functions a lot. And also just briefly, I wanted to go over a little explanation of web application architecture. So this is going to be the most like vanilla terms ever, but you have a client, you have a server, and a database. Why do we have databases? We want to store information, right? So we store information maybe using an HTTP request, and sometimes you need to fetch that information. And that's what we did in the previous workshop. We were connecting to MongoDB in order to store information about a trip or an activity, right? But now today, we're going to talk about how do we actually make the client, the server, and the database talk to each other. And to like explain that in like just 2 words, it's with an API call. And today we'll be explaining how do we use API calls in our code today. So with that being said, we won't be talking about useState, but we'll talk about props.
Okay, so we were supposed to cover this during the last workshop, but we couldn't get to it due to the time constraint. But we'll cover it today. So as I mentioned before, when we did the React workshops and we were doing components, components are reusable and you can also customize them, but you didn't really understand like how you could customize them in the React workshop for the workshop 3, since we didn't introduce props, but now we have props. So props are basically, they stand for like properties. So if you think about your coding classes where you can pass in like parameters and things like that, you're able to basically change, for example, like if you have like a button, you can change like the text of the button with the parameter. You can change like the number of clicks it has. So in this example, you can see how props are used in React, like parameters. So here we have like the props, which is like the name, and then this just says equals click me. And then here we have a button component, and then we pass in the parentheses, I mean, the props variable. And then here you can see how you can do props.name. And then you can see how in the button, it actually says click me now, since we passed in the name click me, and it took it from the props variable, or I guess like you can think of it as like property parameter, however you think is easiest for you to understand, but essentially just takes it in, and then you're able to use it in your component. And we'll see an example of how it can be used in another component. So here, I think this kind of illustrates how we can use props in a lot of different, have a lot of things within a more like a parent component. So here we have a car component. So if you think about car, it has a make, a model, and a year. So these are some different props it can have. So here we have like the make of this car is like a Toyota Camry, like the model of Camry, and then the year is 2001. And then you can see here we have in the cars component, we have props and the parentheses, as I mentioned before, and then we can extract each part of the props. We do like props using the dot operator in JavaScript. We do props.make, so that takes out the make, which is like Toyota, which we pass it over here. You see in the garage component. And then pass it in like model and the year. So to understand this, you don't have to go to garage. So whenever you use props, you're gonna have a parent component that kind of passes in all the props. And when we talk about connecting it to the backend, you'll see how you'll usually be taking all of this information from your backend database. but for now, we're just hard coding it in for the example. So here you can see I've hard coded some constants for the make and model and the year. And there's like strings, so it's like Toyota and Camry 2001. And then you can see here, this is like how you would pass it in. You do like the make equals and then use the brackets. As you know in JavaScript, you have to use the brackets so you can get the actual object in deconstructed. And then here you can just see like you should use the same variables that you use in here. So it should be make, and then model. So just make sure to match it up when you're using prompts, just so it doesn't error. Because if you change this to like make or like something else, then you can't use like prompts.make, you wouldn't recognize it, even if you like pass it in with that. And then some other thing you can do with prompts is it's like a little kind of like more work for you to keep putting like props.make and props.model. So you can use the advantage of JavaScript ES6, which includes object destructuring. So you can essentially, instead of like putting props, you can just like put the brackets directly in there with all of your different props or like parameters to like make model here. And then you're able to just like pass it in like in line, instead of doing like props.make, you can just do like the brackets again. And then this just allows us to extract the values more easily. But yeah, this is like a shorter way to do it, and I recommend doing this since it's way easier than just constantly calling like props. So now for our activity, I have a shortened version of our activity since we can't cover props too much. But for our activity, if you go into your trip card, you should have starter code that almost completes your trip card component, but you have to add the last part, which is just the props. So some props that we need for our trip card is the destination, the start date, the end date, and the journal entry. So you can see your card will end up looking like this once you see on the home page. You should already, if you copied everything correctly from the starter code, you should be able to see an example of what it looks like once you properly put in the props. Let me just make sure, let me just go on to. So if you just go to the VS Code and you go into trip card. So you can see here, I kind of hinted like, oh, you need to add the props inside here. And then you have to put in the props using the brackets, like I mentioned before, in the prop slide of the object destructuring with ES6. And then you have to just add it like here inside the paragraph tag. So I can give you like one example. So for example, once you have defined like destination here, like you have brackets and then you have like destination. Then you can add destination here using the brackets. So that's just one example, but you have to add all the other components. So a little hint is if you go to index.jsx, you can see we actually have an example of how you would add this component hard-coded into the homepage, and you can see all of your different props. So that's just a little hint. So I'll give you guys 5 minutes to work on this activity. And if you have any extra time, you can also work on the activity card. It's pretty simple. The only thing that's like more of a bonus is you can also convert your rating into stars. Because right now it's stored as a string of a number, but you can always just like with this little cool JavaScript trick, you can convert them all to stars. But I'll just let you guys get started right now on the activity, but just focus on making the trip card first. Okay, I'm just gonna, for time's sake, I'll go over the solution. So it was pretty self-explanatory, or well, it's basically just what I had for the slides. We just have destination and we have, wait, give me 1 second. The tab didn't work well, but yeah, so we have in our props for the trip card, we have all the things I said we needed. So destination, start date, end date, and the journal entry. And then you can see how we use the object destructuring here to add it in our React component inside like the p tags. So here we just have like destination, and if you saw here, we actually gave you a function to format your date into a nicer format, since right now we're storing our dates. Well, it's in the MongoDB, it'll be stored as a date object, which makes it like in UTC time, and it kind of makes everything kind of freak out. So this is just like a simple function to convert your date into a more readable format. So you can use it just like this, where you can just do like format date, and then you could pass in your date as a parameter. And then you do that again for end date, and then you would do just like the same as destination for journal entry, since it's just a regular string. And then once you have all that done, you go in your terminal, and remember to be in client for this. So remember to you should be in client for, since you have to do npm install. But here you can just do npm run dev. And then you can open up the server, and now you can see, oh, I think I might have added the date. Yeah, make sure to add the date after the strong tag, since that's what we intended, so we could see the end date, and then it would put like the end date and the start date, then is the end date. And then here, now it should be, I also did it for the journal entry. And then here, and yeah, now it should be good. Okay, so now you can see you have your whole card here. And then I think Sheriff forgot to copy the styles. So if you copy the styles, it should also make it like a nice card. But that should be what it should look like now for the hard-coded values. And you can see here, you're free to like add your own components as well to test it out with like different dates and different journal entries. You can always like copy and paste and like change like the destination, like London instead of Paris. And then now you can see there's 2 trip card components, and you can see how like components can be really useful in React, since you're able to reuse them instead of like just like copy and pasting like the same HTML code. You can just copy in like trip card and then pass in the proper prompts. And then for activities, I will go over this like very briefly, but it's very similar since it's just a bonus activity. Here you just have like trip, activity spot, and rating review, and then you just pass it in the same way where just put it in there. But for a trip, you actually have to do dot destination, since the way we formatted it in MongoDB, it's an object, so then you have to just get the destination component like that. And then you can just see how here I use like the little bonus to put in the rating. That's pretty much it. So now we'll move on to something I think everyone should, it's really helpful, React hooks, since that's the main thing that builds like interactivity into your React pages.
So yeah, we're gonna start talking about React hooks. I'll keep this very straightforward. A React hook is a function that allows for a state and a lifecycle change in a functional component. It allows you to hook into a state and lifecycle feature, and we'll use state and use effect. So let's firstly talk about use state. So the use state hook provides us with a variable and then a setter function that will manipulate that component's state. So a state is just an attribute that can change. And we'll use this particular format, value and set value, where your value refers to your current state and the set value will refer to like how exactly you're changing the state. So I think it's best to look at an example. So this is in relation to the add trip component. So as you can see right here, this destination is like it's the variable that you start with. And it has this initial value that you could see over here, and set destination is the function by which you're changing your destination. And you could do the same thing with your start date. So when you're setting the start date, you can imagine this being used, right? So like, for example, I'm a user using our website and I'm trying to, fill out our form, right? And I'm setting the destination, I'm setting the start date. Now using use state, we're able to update these variables essentially from its initial value of these like this blank string. So before I head into the activity, I wanted to do like just a very quick practice of like how this would look like for add trip in particular. So go into VS Code and close up your components and head into add trip. Cool. So yeah, we'll do destination and start date first. So how this is going to work is you're going to use const and you're going to do destination. This is your initial, and now we're going to use our setter function, and we're going to define this using set destination. Cool, and we're going to use useState, and then our quotes, and a semicolon. Cool. Oh, and don't forget, you got to import. I clearly forgot. So we're going to do import. useState from React. Cool. So that's the first one. Now let's do the second one. So you're going to do const, and then you're going to have your start date. Set your start date. useState. And end it. Cool. So that's an example. But now you're wondering, oh, Shreya, all right, so like where's the function to actually update set destination or setting your start date? Where we're going to do that is we're going to go into your return. So like this is the part where your form is, right? So this is the form in which the user is going to interact with, and this is how like it's going to be updating the values. So it makes sense to define the function by which your values are going to be updated in this form itself. So let's start with start destination. So we have our class name, name is destination. So now keep an eye on what I'm writing. So you're going to do on change in or you're going to do these brackets, parentheses inside here. Cool. And you're going to use an arrow function. Here's our function name. And now we're going to take our e value. So we're going to do e dot target dot value. And we still want this to be required, right? So we're going to just move this up here. So I'm going to explain this one more time. So there you go. So this is the function by which you're updating your destination. And because it's kind of like integrated within the form itself, it'll take the value that you're uploading into the form and update kind of this variable called destination. So cool. Now we did that for destination. We can do that for start date. It's going to look very similar. So I'm going to just copy and paste what I have right here. Except we're going to obviously change set start date. There you go. So we're going to move on to a very quick activity that will kind of like use what we learned here. And in the add trip, don't forget, we need to set an end date and we need to set an entry. So I'm going to give you maybe like 6 minutes to try that. And then also in that same time, try to work on add activity as well and add index or like just index. So look at the trip, select a trip activity. And I want you to really think about what is your initial value supposed to be for some of these variables. I don't expect you to get it right on the first try, and we'll go over everything afterwards. But go ahead and try this activity. We'll give you guys maybe like 8 minutes. All right, guys, it's okay if you're not done. Let me go over kind of the solutions for this. So let's go back into add trip. And as it says literally in the starter code, we want to do this for destination, start date, end date, and entry. So let's go ahead and do that. It's going to be really easy. Just copy and paste these 2 lines, update them here. We want end date and we want our entry. So we just do end date, entry. And once again, we'll be updating this over here. Cool, sounds good. Now we can go to add activity. Maybe some of y'all got this, but I really emphasize that you guys should really think about what should be the initial value of what you're doing. And I didn't really explain what each one of these were, but hopefully review makes sense. That's the review, that's going to be the inputted value. Rating should hopefully make sense. Activity, selected trip will be the trip that maybe your Google form or like the form is going to be looking at. But I didn't explain what trips was. And that's okay. Let's first start with the ones that you kind of do know. So I'm gonna copy and paste what we kind of started with over here, just so we have some sort of baseline. So selected trip, activity, rating, you. And now trips is going to be it's going to be an array that's going to take into consideration like all of the trips that you've uploaded through this form. So you can imagine we want to store this information somewhere, right? Because we want to show it, like we want to put it on the website at some point. So that means we need to save this value, and it can't just be in a simple string, right? Because you can imagine like a string would kind of rewrite itself every single time that you were to fill out this form. So the best thing that we can use here is going to be an array. So here we could have trips and set trips. But instead, we're going to have our use state. What's this? And don't forget, like me, don't forget to import. Cool. And now let's start using these in kind of like over here. So let's start with like set review. Next, we'll do set rating. And here we're modifying it for activity. And by the way, if you have any questions, just raise your hand, just because this is a lot of like lecturing to y'all. So I understand if problems may come up. So just raise your hand and one of us will come around and help you out. Cool. Now for the big one, which is going to be set selected trip, right? So here we need to implement our kind of like function. So as you could see over here, what we have right here is kind of like default value. Right here, we have default values for what a trip could be. Like, for example, we have Honolulu, Hawaii, we have London, right? But we want to make sure that we're actually like selecting trips that we're doing. We want to make sure that this is dynamic, right? In better words. So let's start by firstly like implementing on change. And I'm going to start by deleting all of this. So cool. So now that we've kind of like made this dynamic, now we need to kind of like upload this dynamically. So we're going to start by using these curly braces. And we'll be using a map. So we're going to do trips.map. So this is like trips is our kind of like our array where all the trips are in. And now we want to map each trip, right? So we'll start by going like this. And we want to take our trip right here. And we want to make an arrow function. And this will be kind of like this. Cool. And then we'll use our option. Here, our key will be, it will be trips or trip dot underscore ID. So this will be like the ID, and here we'll have our value. So we're creating a mapping. Now what goes in here, we're going to take our trip destination. And we're going to take our formatted date. So that's how you like dynamically kind of like add values into your trips. So once again, to repeat, trips is an array. Trip is going to be a value in that array. And here we're creating options. So our like the key is like our trip ID, and the value is also going to be the trip ID in this case. And here we're adding information into this trip. So when we later want to fetch a value in trip, you can display that as you need. So yeah. If you have any questions or if you're getting any errors based off of this, raise your hand. But we're not done yet. We have to once again add this to index. So I'll be going a little bit faster because I have the code over here, but try to follow along if possible. So we're going to take trips and activities. Here we also want to make like activities an array. So let's go back here and remove these. So there's trips. And we also have activities. And we'll leave that for now. Cool, but we're not done yet. So now, as you can see over here, we have a lot of like trip cards. So we have one to Paris, and we have one for like the activities that we did in Paris. So we're going to build off of what we kind of did in the beginning of this, where Angela was talking about props, and we're going to start filling out our cards once again dynamically using information that we have saved in props, as well as the information that we'll have like in trips and set trips. So let's go down into trips and activities. I'm going to remove kind of like the default information that we have right here. And remove it as well over here. So once again, we're going to create a mapping. So what we need to do right here is we want to display information from the array. If there's nothing in the array, we don't want to display anything. So we need to make this kind of like as an if-else statement. So if there is information, so trips dot length greater than 0, question mark. And now we're going to do parentheses. Now we need to look at the map. So trips dot map. And now we're going to use our trip card. And don't forget, our key is going to be trip dot underscore ID. And now we're going to use like the props that we have in association with that. So we're going to use trip like this. And don't forget one last thing, which is going to be importing trip card, as you can see over here, as well. And now we kind of have to do like the else portion of this. So we're gonna go like this, where we're gonna write that there's no trips available. And you can imagine that we would do pretty much the exact same thing for activities as well, which I'll copy and paste a little bit later. Does anyone have any questions on this? Or if you have any errors, just feel free to raise your hand. Cool. I understand that was a bit, so we'll move on to API calls. So we use Axios in order to like streamline API calls. The reason why we're doing this is because once it's a promise-based API, and the key thing is that it automatically handles like JSON data. So that's why we're going to be using it today. So hopefully no one had any issues running npm install Axios. If you came late, feel free to do that in your terminal real fast. But let's talk about GET requests and POST requests using Axios. Who remembers what a GET request is? I promise we covered it. Who can guess? Nobody? Okay, so what an API does is that it sends information, right? So like we want to send information and we also want to retrieve information. Who can guess what GET does? Will it send or retrieve? Cool. Okay, yeah, it's gonna retrieve because it's GET. Yeah. So let's start by making a new folder called API. And this is going to be within our source file folder. So here you go. We're gonna make API. And in this, we're going to make a file called index.js. So this is a JavaScript file. And you're just gonna copy and paste what you have right here into this file. So pardon me as I slowly type my way like this. So we're going to import Axios from Axios. And I'm going to make a variable called server URL. And this is going to take your HTTPS. So I'm using localhost 3000. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. And now we're going to make something called travel API. So in here, we're going to have like our get trip, our post trip, our get activity, and our post activity. So here we'll get started with get trip. And get trip doesn't need to send over any information. So we're just going to just basically like copy and paste what you have right here. And I'll give you just a couple minutes to go ahead and do that. Okay. And if you want to double check what this like local host number should be, go into your env file that you should have. It should be called .env, and that will kind of have the number that you should need. So like perhaps you have 5050, perhaps you have 4000, I don't know. So yeah, just double check that. So we need to make one for get trip and get activity. So it's just going to look like this. And now we need to make a GET request with Axios. So we're going to use like a format similar to this in GET activity. So as you can see right here, we want to use the async function because we're waiting for information from GET trip, right? We want information about the trip and we want to put that into response. And then we can upload that information about the trip into set trips. And if you recall, set trips is the function that we made over here that will store information about the trips. So if that makes sense, we can go ahead and start implementing that into add activity. Or add activity. And you can imagine that we will need to use fetch trips in index as well. And we'll also need to do the same thing for activities right here. Cool. So that's how we do our GET requests. But we're not done yet. We need to do our post requests. So who remembers what a post request does? It's going to be the opposite of GET. So what can it do? It's going to send information. So that's why, as you can see right here, we're going to take a payload and we need to send that, right? So like, this is how it's going to look like. You have one for post trip and post activity, and you're going to send information with it. So let's start by adding it into index. So we're going to write post trip, payload, oh, and we also need to add payload over here. Cool. Now let's add that into add activity. And we'll need to also add it into add trip. So this is going to be a bit, so stay with me and raise your hand if you have any questions. So when we want to send information, when do we do that, right? We have a form and that's how we send quote unquote information. So we fill it out and then with that, we need to send it, right? So we need to create a function called handle submit that's going to kind of like involve this post trip or post activity that will, use the API. So let's create a function called handle submit. And it's going to take an event variable called E. And it's once again going to be an arrow function. So if you can imagine like submitting a form, usually what happens? Well, this is kind of nitpicky, but the form actually reloads, right? So we want to stop that from happening because you can imagine if like the form were to reload automatically, like that information like would get lost. So we need to do E dot prevent default. And now we need to kind of like format these strings again. So these are going to be const formatted start date and end date. And now we're gonna use the await again to make our post trip. And if you remember, we have our schema defined in server, and we're gonna be using that again over here. So we'll have destination, our start date, which is going to use this formatted start date. And next we need our end date, which is going to use a formatted end date. And finally, we're gonna include our journal entry. And now when we submit our form, we want to do one additional thing. We want to send ourselves back into our homepage, right? We don't want to just stay on this form. So we're going to import one last thing, which is going to be use router. So this will help like route our pages so that it can do exactly as I mentioned. So we'll use router. And we'll import this from next/router. And we'll create a variable called router using use router. And we'll call that down here. Like this. Cool. Now we need to like actually implement that over here. So we're going to copy and paste handle submit. And you're going to go where exactly your form is. So mine is like line 49. And we're going to add it in right here. So it's going to be on submit equals handle submit. Cool. So that's how we do it for add activity. Now I'm going to give you guys maybe like 5 minutes to go ahead and try something similar in index dot, like in your index file in pages. So yeah, we'll give you guys like 10 minutes and feel free to literally just use what we have right here, like in handle submit, in add trip and index. So yeah, and just remember, we use handle submit when we're trying to upload something to a form, right? So think about where you have your form and try to implement something similar, handle submit in those areas as well. So yeah, 10 minutes. And feel free to discuss with each other. All right, guys, just one last thing before we go into use effect. So the answer to this activity was you go into add trip and then you just needed to copy and paste this handle submit and add it over here to the form. Oh, I guess I didn't add it. So let's add it together. So let's go to, as you can see over here, what we did for class name and then trip form. We're going to do the same thing over here where you update it as such. So yeah, and then the way that we got kind of like the values that are supposed to be over here is that if you recall correctly, if you go into server controllers, this is exactly the same thing. So you kind of already defined the schema like in a previous kind of like week, and we're just using this schema once again over here. So we know kind of the values that are supposed to be there. So hopefully this gave you kind of like not even a brief explanation of what or how to use post and get with Axios as well. But yeah, with that being said, that's enough for API calls and we'll move on to use effect.
Okay, so going on to use effect, is essentially, it defines a function that creates an effect, which will run at like 3 points. And I think Shreya mentioned life cycle at one point, and I just wanted to go into that because it's helpful for understanding when it will run. But we have 3 life cycles: the mount, which is like when it first renders, and then update when it's like a state changes and then it updates whatever is rendered, and then dismount or unmount, and that's when the component is no longer used and it like kind of throws it away or removes it. And these effects can include getting data outside of components, like such as API calls, which is what we did, or what we will be doing. And I just wanted to go over how
to do the different life cycles. So for the mount, this would be when the component first renders, and here inside here is like an empty dependency array. And this basically means that on the first render, fetch trips will be rendered onto whatever on add activities. And then this is different from if you're adding a state inside of the dependency array. So whenever that state updates is when fetch trips will also be called. And then this is when it's being, when the effect finishes and then after it returns, it will do some type of cleanup of the side effects. Like if there's some unwanted loop or an interval that you want to get rid of. And so it's going to be really simple for like the code. You're going to go to add activity. And then we're just going to do this under here. But first you want to import use state or use effect. And then if you look at these three options that we have, we want to be rendering it when the component first renders. We don't want it to be dependent on any state. So we're going to be using an empty dependency array, or yeah. And then you could take a look at the syntax here also if you're having trouble following, but you're going to do an arrow function, and then inside of that would be fetch trips, which is going to be using the function that we just made. And then here is where you would put your, oops. And then this is all you have to do for add activity at least. And you're going to be doing the same thing for in index.jsx because you want to render the trips and the activities. So just paste that and do fetch activities. And every time this page renders, it's going to be doing fetch trips and fetch activities. And then that's it for use effects. And so we'll just get into deployment. Does anyone have any questions on use effects so far? Huh? Oh, yes. You just remind me, I didn't do that for index, but. So just import it right by use state, both for index.jsx and add activity. So all the way at the top. Okay, I'll just be going on to deployment, and we're going to be using Vercel and render. And so why Vercel and render? Well, just generally, it's one of the more easy ones to use or to set up. But for Vercel, we're going to be using this for our front end, and it's optimized for static sites that are more simpler, and it's great for React and Next.js. And it also has a fast load time with automated global distributions and easy integration with GitHub and automatic previews. And also it's serverless, so it supports lightweight backend tasks, which we don't really have any like heavyweight ones since all we're doing is calling from our API. And then for render, it supports full stack and handles complex backend servers, and also has easy deployment, and you can add multiple environments, and it's also very flexible with a lot of languages and frameworks. And so basically, to summarize, Vercel excels in front-end development or deployment, and render excels in back-end deployment. So I'll be walking through how to deploy on Vercel. So just before we get started, make sure that you pushed all your code onto the GitHub repository, because it's gonna be on Vercel, we're gonna be pulling from that GitHub. And then you also wanna create an account on Vercel. Okay, so I will be just doing that with you guys, but I already have an account, but. Okay, is everyone done setting up their account for Vercel and like push their code? I'm just gonna assume. Okay, so. To deploy our project onto Render. Wait, let me see. Oh, I mean Vercel. You guys are gonna go to add new and then press projects. And then I'm just gonna do this from the ACM UCSD, but you guys can add your GitHub account onto here. And then you would just choose whichever, but I'm just gonna skip that part. And just do it from ACM UCSD and. For whichever project that you guys want to deploy, you want to import, and I'll just be importing from the solutions since I haven't pushed from my repo. And so from here, you want to make sure that you're choosing your root directory. And in this case, it will be like the root directory that contains your front end. So we're choosing client. And automatically, it's going to preset the framework to next.js, which is what we want. And then we want to change the build commands and the install. And then we're gonna do npm run build for build commands and npm install for the install command. And then we'll be adding on the environment variables later, once we have render deployed. But this is gonna be what connects it to the backend. And then this should deploy, and it should show here. If there's an error, it will stop deploying and show inside the build logs. And then once it's deployed successfully, you'll be able to see it here, and I'll show you a preview. And then you could just continue to dashboard. And then you'll be able to access your website from this link that they give you in domains, and you can go to add trip or add activity. Okay, is anyone having trouble with the deploying or needs help so far? I think we're good. Okay, so I'm gonna move on to deploying the backend with render. And first, you want to make sure that you have your render account set up. And I already have mine set up, but I just have to log in. And once you're on the dashboard for render, you want to make sure that you can create your, or to look for the new button and then create a web service. And you can choose your project from your Git provider, or just put a link to a public Git repository and then connect. And you want to make sure that it's pulling from the correct branch. So I'm just going to pull from main. And you have to make sure you change the root directory to the backend, which would be server. And then we'll be changing our build command and start command to npm install. And then npm run dev. And you could just choose the free plan. And now for setting the environment variables, you want to make sure that you have your .inv inside server. And then you can see on the .inv and you just want to copy that and add it to your environmental variables. And instead of this URL, you want to make sure that it's like the correct one connected to your MongoDB. So for mine, I don't have that, I think. So I'll just like leave this as is. But you want to paste it here and then add it as a variable. And then you want to deploy your web service. And it's going to show that it's building for a bit. And then once it's done building, I'll show you guys how to connect it to the front end. The way that you connect the back end to the front end will be by going to deploy hook inside settings. And if you scroll down, you'll find it in build and deploy. And you could just copy that and go back to Vercel. And in its settings, you want to go to environment variable and change the DB URL value to the URL that you copied from render. And then you also want to add the port, and this should be the same one as the one that you have inside your env file. And then you should be able to save that. And once that's connected, you want to reload your deployment. And it should be connected to your database. And all of this should render. Okay, I have all the instructions on the slides and I'll just walk around and help you guys set up if you need it.